Good morning and welcome to Rhode Island. I have a close personal relationship with the state of Rhode Island. I have relatives, distant relatives that I used to visit every summer and vacation on the coast of Rhode Island with. I worked there as a teenager on an island called Block Island, which we'll visit. And Carol and I lived there for a year when I went to the Naval War College, which is a graduate school. Begin by expressing a concern. If you notice, the full title of the state of Rhode Island is the State of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations. That latter term, Providence Plantations, has always bothered me. While slaves were not generally used on plantations in Rhode Island, slave trade was a large part of its colonial economy. More than half of the ships that engaged in slave trade were from Rhode Island, and particularly a group of brothers, Brown brothers, were the ones that financed those slave trading ships. They sent ships to West Africa to buy slaves, transported them to the West Indies, where they were traded for cane sugar, which they then brought to Newport, where it was distilled into rum that was sold both in the colonies and in Europe. You might recognize the name Brown associated with Rhode Island, because the Brown brothers financed the early development of Brown University. The good news is that Rhode Island was the first state to make slave trading illegal, and they did so in 1652, over 200 years before the Civil War. I might add that Brown University was not the only Ivy League school involved in slave trade. The state of Rhode Island has a lot of water, almost like the state of Maryland has the Chesapeake Bay. The Narragansett Bay, which is this big body of water, is what constitutes a large part of the state of Rhode Island. But it has played a significant role, just as the Chesapeake Bay played a significant role in U.S. history, so has the Narragansett Bay. It has been extremely important in both World War I and in World War II, even more so in World War II, to the defense of the North Atlantic. We'll touch upon that a little bit later. This is a lighthouse on one of those islands. It's called Jamestown Island. And you can look at it two ways. It's keeping mariners away from these very rocky shoals as they proceed up the bay, primarily to Providence, Rhode Island. But I tend to look at it as a light that is welcoming us today and welcomes visitors to Rhode Island all the time. Back on that slide, apologize. If you look down in the lower left, you'll notice where we are outside of Baltimore. And if you go straight up I-95 through Delaware, through New Jersey, through New York City, along the coast of Connecticut, you wind up in Rhode Island and eventually the area of Newport, where we'll be spending most of our time. How did we get there? This is when I was going to graduate school at the Naval War College. We rented a house up there, but we needed to take our furniture. And so we piled it into this Ryder truck and proceeded to drive the 11-hour trip up to Rhode Island. One of the problems we had was, in those days, you could not tow a car on the New Jersey Turnpike. So that meant that Carol had to drive behind me. Well, she did so closely that those side mirrors on the truck, I could not see her for most of the trip. When we got close to New York or in northern New Jersey, before going over the George Washington Bridge, which is on your left, going from New Jersey over into Manhattan, I stopped and I gave her alternate routes where we could meet up if we had a problem going across the bridge. We proceeded on up to the bridge, came out of the toll, and lo and behold, I was in the far left lane going across the bridge, and there was a car broken down in the middle of the bridge. Well, I slowed down, put my direction signal on. Nobody would let me move over. And I was concerned about Carol losing me if I just went over and went ahead. Finally, I had to make the decision that I was going to move over. Well, as you know, you have a big truck and you start to move over, people get out of your way. But as I'm moving over, all of a sudden I'm hearing all sorts of brakes and horns and lots of noise, because when I moved over to go in, Carol followed right behind me. It's a miracle that she did not get hit. But we continued along our way and made it to Newport. This is Newport from the air. It is a delightful town to have spent a year, although I knew it from previous incarnations. And I hope that you get to know it a little bit today. A little bit of history. A lady by the name of Hutchison. She was a very devout Christian, but she was a woman. And she had some slightly different takes on Christianity than some of the men in the Boston area where she lived. So much so that they banished her from the Boston or Massachusetts colony. And she fled to Newport, Rhode Island, where she joined as the leader of creating the city we now know as Newport. But in so doing, she brought religious freedom to Newport. She brought a concept that we take for granted today, but was not prevalent in the colonies at that point in time, and that is a separation of church and state. She was one of the first individuals to push for that. She was also an individual, unlike many of the other colonists, that befriended the local natives. She was not looked upon kindly upon that. This is Newport again. It is a sailing mecca. Whether you're doing day sailing or around the world sailing or in major yachting races, this is the place to go on the East Coast. A number of years ago, the America's Cup used to be raced, couldn't think of the word, sorry, here off of Newport. Unfortunately, several years ago, the Australians won, and then eventually the New Zealanders won, and consequently, the America's Cup race has now been out in the Pacific and not done in the Atlantic. But still, people remember the America's Cup in Newport. Newport is an enchanting place. Picturesque little shops and restaurants, streets, but I'd warn you, do not go in July and August. Maybe this year with the virus, but July and August, the place is very, very crowded with tourists. I highly recommend going in September or early October. The trees are beautiful and the tourists are not there. This is a collection of pictures of downtown Newport. One on the left, you can see again the shops and the areas, the boating areas. some of the shops in the center of town on the right and bottom pictures, but I would direct your attention to the church in the center. It's called Trinity Church, and it was built in 1698. Many a bride wants to be married there. But it's also, if you go into the church, you'll notice a lot of us don't really see from history, but George Washington spent a lot of time in New England, and he spent a lot of time in Newport. And he even had a pew to himself. I mentioned religious freedom. Newport was the center of religious freedom in the colonies. This is the first synagogue ever constructed in the United States. It's called Turo. It was constructed by approximately 300 Spanish Jews who had been persecuted in Spain, and when they heard about Newport, they came to Newport. They built a beautiful synagogue that people still worship in today. They also did something else that we don't read about in our history books. They became the merchants and a very wealthy class within Newport. And at the time of the American Revolution, they funded a great deal of it. Newport is on an island. It's on the lower part of what's called Aquidneck Island, which is an Indian name. There are 3 townships, and we'll get to those a little bit later, but Newport is on the lower half of the island towards the Atlantic Ocean. It is on the right. That orange line is where most of what people come to Newport to see, and that is the mansions. Mansions were built starting in about 1850, 1860, up through the turn of the century, and they were built by millionaires of the day. They came to Newport just for 2 months of the year, July and August, to get out of the heat of Boston, New York, Philadelphia, or elsewhere. But yet they built some magnificent structures. This, if you look in the center of the picture, you'll see an oval, is something that most people don't know about. And that is, it is the home of the Tennis Hall of Fame. You can see the court, and then the stands around the court, and then there are other grass courts. The netting is not all up in this picture, but it's a place each year that certain pro tennis players are inducted into the Hall of Fame. Carol and I remember it from, if you look at those buildings from sort of a triangle, that point up at the top is where our dentist was. And if you went down the street to the lower right, that's where we went to the doctor. But the street in front of these buildings is called Bellevue. And Bellevue is where all the mansions that were built from, say, 1850 to about 1905. If you go in the summer, this street will be crowded with tourists. There'll be horse-drawn carts, there'll be buses, so on and so forth. You can tell this is in the winter, no leaves on the trees and no tourists. It's when folks like myself would go to the mansions. We begin by going to the most popular mansion, and that is the Breakers. It was built by Commodore Vanderbilt, Cornelius Vanderbilt, and it was a summer college, again, inspired by palaces in the north of it. north of Italy. I'll call your attention, I'll come back to it. You'll notice there's a path going along the ocean, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes, but I wanted to call your attention to it. This is the inside of the breakers. Opulence knows no bounds. As Italian marble, very ornate ceilings, French furniture, but if you were to look closer, you would find that there are diamonds, rubies, and other precious gems encrusted in the walls of this room. He brought together a team of about 150 artisans to create a 70-room Renaissance retreat. A place today where you can tour, but you can go also and hear some very outstanding concerts. Every time I look at this picture or remember this room, I say, it's not a place that I personally could sit and feel comfortable. But apparently they did during that period. Marble House. Marble House has a very, very favorable memory for Carol and I. As I said, I went to the Naval War College. And during the year, the Army had its ball, the Navy had its ball, the Marine Corps had its ball. Well, the Air Force officers and myself were sort of left out. So we decided to have a Christmas ball. And we rented Marble House. We had it catered for a dinner and orchestrated dancing. But we went one step further. We hired off-duty policemen, Newport policemen, to be at the door, and you drove up this driveway, came to the portico, got out of your car, they opened the car doors, escorted you inside, and then they parked your car safely, and then when the evening was over, they brought it back. It was a delightful evening. All the officers were in their Class A or equivalent high tuxedo type dress. The women were all in ball gowns. It was like being back at the turn of the 19th century. This house in 1890 dollars cost about $11 million. $7 million was part of the cost of Italian marble. But as you can see, there's a lot more to Marble House than just the marble on the outside. The ceilings are just gorgeous. My grandfather used to do this kind of ceiling work, and so I have a great impression on how long it takes to do it and how much of a skill it takes to make something as beautiful as that ceiling. His wife had interests in the Far East, and she loved Chinese tea rooms. So she had one built on the end of the property where she could go out and have her afternoon tea and look out over the Atlantic Ocean. The next house that we're going to look at is called the ELMS. It takes its inspiration from chateaus along the Seine in France. It was built by a coal baron by the name of Julius Berwin. Again, splendid ceilings. I'm not necessarily in love with the chandeliers, but the artwork on the ceiling as well as the walls are absolutely gorgeous. Like its counterparts in France, he also did the landscaping in a French type motif. We now move to Rosecliff. It's commissioned by a Nevada silver heiress. And it is patterned, believe it or not, doesn't look very beautiful from the outside, but it's patterned after a retreat of French kings at Versailles. Definitely can see the French type decor. For me, it has one of the best views in its back lawn, looking high out and across the Atlantic as you look across this pool. Chateau Silver has similar architecture to the previous house, but a little bit larger. This has more of a Victorian look than a French look inside, although it's still very ornate ceilings, and that's gold up around the ceiling trim. But it's an area, particularly in the top picture, where I could sit in those chairs and be comfortable by that fire. I mentioned a walkway previously. If you look at the rocks, you will see, it might be hard on the TV to see, but people walking around. It's a pathway. It's a national park pathway that goes for 3.5 miles. And you can walk behind all of these mansions and get glorious views, see the same views that they could see from their houses. This is a new house. It's built relatively new, 1935. It's owned by somebody that you probably have seen on the television. It has almost 15,000 square foot, 8 bedrooms, 11 bathrooms, and 7 fireplaces. It was bought about 5 years ago by its current owner for $3.5 million. I'll give you a hint. You can look at the rectangular type building to the left of the main structure, and that is a automobile garage. You haven't guessed it already. It's Jay Leno's house. He owns several houses in California, but he spends the summer here in Newport. Some of you watch afternoon TV. This is Judge Judy's house in Newport. She has 2 houses in Florida, but she has another one here that she spends, again, the summer in Newport. A lot of soup was consumed to build this house. It is on 1 floor, although it may look like it's 2 floors. That's really to let sunlight into the various rooms. Those windows on what looks like the 2nd floor. I love the stone wall. It reminds me of when we lived in England. This is a relatively new house, about 15 years old. It's the home to the champion figure skater Michelle Kwan. She lives there year-round. While this house does not sit out on the Atlantic Ocean, it sits out looking to the Narragansett Bay. Newport would be to the right. The bridge became going between Newport and Jamestown is in the far top of the picture. But this is one of my favorite houses. It's called their Fair Home. It's empty currently. It's up for sale. Now, if you're interested, it's 25,000 square feet. It has 15 bedrooms, 12 full and 2 half baths, a magnificent staircase, an elevator, formal living and dining rooms, a gourmet kitchen, a library, a ballroom, a greenhouse, and 2 docks, all for the minimum price of $26 million. Some of you may recognize this house. It's very famous back in the 1960s. It's called Hammersmith Farm. If you don't know who lived there, I'll give you a clue. This young girl grew up there. Still don't recognize her? Well, try that. There's Jackie Kennedy. That is where Jackie Kennedy lived and grew up as a child. Newport is also where she was married, at St. Mary's Catholic Church in downtown Newport. She had her wedding reception outside in a bunch of tents on the back of the farm. And both she and JFK would come there frequently. For the first 18 months of his presidency, this was the summer White House. You say, oh no, that was up in Massachusetts. No, that was for the latter part of his presidency. This first 18 months was in Newport. One of the problems with the mansions is when they left them to their heirs, they cost a lot of money to maintain, high taxes, and a lot of them wanted rid of them. So they donated them, many of them, to the Newport Historical Society, which today maintains them. But they also donated several to a small Catholic university by the name of Salve Regina. What did Salve Regina do with them? They turned them into dorms. Students go there and get to live in a mansion for 4 years. This is a map back in the 1777 of Newport. You can see a little bit of island down at the bottom. There's a bridge connecting it today. But what I wanted to point out was those streets just to the center left of the map. It's an area called the Gray Ladies. There's some in there that certainly aren't gray, and you'll see them in a minute. But there's 2 things about this map. I'm going to show you those houses there. But before Rockefeller decided to build Williamsburg, he wanted to build Newport. He wanted to take those houses, buy them up, and create something similar to what he created in Williamsburg. As I say, this map goes back to 1777, and it always blows my mind that a lot of the dirt roads that are on that map are maps that I would travel very frequently when we lived there in Newport. The houses in the bottom of the color are gray. But over time, a lot of the houses have been painted other colors. These date back to the 1700s. They are not museums. People buy them, just as you and I, and they live in them and raise their children. Very, very thankful, because these great ladies are very, very beautiful. As I said, some of them are not necessarily gray, particularly the blue. I don't know how the Historic Society allowed them to paint that blue, but they did, and it adds a little charm to the community. A couple more of them. The one to the right is not a house. It is known as the White Horse Tavern. It is the oldest tavern in the United States, and it still functions as one today. Although the outsides of the houses may look like they were from colonial time, many of them, or most of them, have been remodeled, and although they tried to keep some of the architecture, they improved it to today's standards. If you'll note, behind that quartz or marble table or sink, those are refrigerators back there. This house, it has intrigued me from day one. It has 15 rooms. It's an outcrop of rock about 2 miles away from downtown Newport and about 3/4 of a mile away from the bridge. What's unique about it, and it's hard to see in this picture, but it has solar panels up on the top. That windmill generates electricity also, so it's self-sufficient in terms of electricity. But it also has a desalination equipment to take the seawater, take the salt out of it, and make it drinking water. It also has its own sanitation system, or sewer system, which takes effluent, cleanses it, and then meets EPA standards of putting it back into the bay. Newport Jazz Festival is one of the reasons why you don't go in July. All the people that come for over 70 years to the Newport Jazz Festival. I mentioned earlier that the Narragansett Bay has played a big role in the defense of the United States. The Navy during World War II inhabited almost all of the Narragansett Bay. That has shrunk over the years. Again, we're looking at Newport. Newport is to the right. Mansions are out along by the water. And these are some of the other cities. There's a city called Middletown, and then Portsmouth, which is to the north. The red line and to the bottom is where the U.S. Navy has its major facility today. Today, you don't see any ships there because it's mostly schooling. There are schools there, particularly down in the right type of peninsula, that are the Officer Candidate School. That is, if you didn't go to ROTC and you didn't graduate from the Naval Academy, you must go through a 12-week program, Officer Candidate School, here in Newport, before you pin on that bar signifying you're an ensign in the U.S. Navy. But it has other schools, a justice school. You graduate from law school, you pass the bar, but you're still not an expert in naval law or in the Uniform Code of Military Justice. So you go for a 3-month school here at Newport and need to pass another equivalent of a bar exam. As they say in the military, if you don't have logistics, you don't do anything. This is the school, Naval Supply Corps school, that teaches people how to move everything the Navy needs or the Marine Corps needs anywhere in the world. And then a chaplain school. Again, you graduated from college, you went off to seminary, and you may have been ordained. But whether you're a minister, priest, a rabbi, so on and so forth, you need to come to Newport for a 14-week course in how to become a chaplain. Because a chaplain just does not meet the faith needs of their particular religion, but meets the needs of all naval personnel, no matter their religion. This is another school that very few people know about. It is the Naval Academy Preparatory School. It has been in existence since 1917. What it is every year 100 enlisted, people that have enlisted in the Navy, have been in the Navy, that have applied, they want to go to the Naval Academy, but they may not have had, they may not be up to the academic standards. So they come here to Newport. They are selected by their commanding officer and appointed. They come for 11 months. They get instruction in English composition, mathematics, chemistry, physics, and information technology. I've got to tell you, these folks are highly motivated. That is their daily schedule for 11 months. And they work, and they work. They almost have nobody dropping out. Usually it's only because of illness, but they drop out maybe 1% every year. And in August, they enter the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis as a plebe. This is a school that I went to. This is the U.S. Naval War College. It's for senior military officers. It does not teach war. When you get to be a senior military officer, you become more politically oriented. Therefore, you must know history. You must know how to not do war, but to recommend ways to prevent war. And that's what this school studies. I need, before talking more about the War College, to point out the building down at the lower right. In the Civil War years, the Naval Academy in Annapolis was closed because there was fear that the Confederate forces would take it over. It was moved to Newport, and that is the building for 4 years where the Naval Academy conducted its studies. I would point out the building behind that to the right, just the upper right, is the building of the president of the Naval War College. Had the privilege of having lunch there many times with visiting dignitaries. But I want to point out something that was really great about the War College. You notice this road in front of the buildings. Well, you come in through a gatehouse off on the right. You come in. Carol used to love the fact that she'd go through the gatehouse and get saluted. Anyway, come around here, come around and go into that entrance, and you had a parking space. So in the middle of the winter, the storms could be underground parking place, park your car, and I'd go up to my area where my desk was and cubicle. It was a nice cubicle because it was on the windows on that top floor looking out over the Narragansett Bay. The lady in the top right, or the admiral, as I should say, is the current president of the Naval War College. The folks gathered around these flags are some of the students that went to the Naval War College or go there every year. They represent 33 nations. The school that I went to had 125 U.S. officers and 33 officers from around the world. U.S. officers weren't all naval officers. They were from the Navy, the Marines, the Coast Guard, the Army, and yes, even the Air Force. Leaving the War College, we lived up where this says the Glen-Seconic River. It's called a river. I kept calling it a bay because it empties right out into the North Atlantic. I never saw it as being a river. But anyway, that's where we lived in Portsmouth. It was about a 12-minute ride to the War College. That is the Seconic River, and I had a little sailboat that I would take out on the river. We lived up and to the left. Lots of nice fields, open countryside as compared to a little bit more crowded Middletown and Newport. It was an area, my son was in the 8th grade at the time, and he roamed every inch of these grounds. We did not live in a palace or a mansion. This was the house that we rented for the year that we stayed in Newport. The house was just to the left, lovely stone walls, again reminded us of England. But I put this picture in because of the trees. Those are maple trees. And to our surprise, in late February, early March, the local elementary school brought children to tap the maple trees and get the maple syrup out of it. As a city boy, I thought that was great. If one goes down that road for about, a third of a mile, you come to a real mansion. This is called Glen Manor. It is owned by the city or township of Portsmouth, and it is rented out for all sorts of events. Mostly weddings, all types of reception type things. Beautiful grounds, had a very nice dock, and it was an area that we could walk down and walk around in the evening when there weren't events going on. Again, our home was up to the left, and some of the fields around us, particularly one here, is used for polo matches. Polo matches were brought by the folks that lived in the mansions down in Newport. Well, there weren't big spaces to do polo fields, so they brought them out here. Particularly Vanderbilt bought this land and brought polo matches to the area. Now, polo matches were already here in the United States. A number of the people in New York, there were polo teams out in a suburb at that point in time called Westchester County. It's where I grew up. And they had a team out there called the Westchester Polo Club. Well, when they built their mansions, they took the polo club and moved it to Newport. There are lots of barns for the horses that are around these fields. But the really weird thing, the Newport Polo Club is not known as the Newport Polo Club. It's known as the Westchester Polo Club. We now leave Aquidneck Island and Newport on the right, go across through Jamestown, and we're going to go up to a town up the top there called Wickford. Wickford is another little town that sailors love to go to. It's a nice, safe anchorage and a pretty town to walk around. It was established in 1709, by the way, and it has the largest collection of owner-occupied colonial and federal period homes in the nation. Homes similar to Newport, it just was a beautiful little town, and it had lovely gardens, and we used to love to go over there for the day and just walk around and enjoy. We're now going to leave Wickford and come south into an area that I know very well. As a kid, I used to spend my summers in this area. I have lots of friends that live there, and so it's an area I know very well. But I also know it from World War II. Along that coast of where the water is, it's again the Narragansett Bay. The Atlantic Ocean is at the bottom. That was an area that was totally closed off to the public during World War II for several reasons. Ships would put their ammunition loaded onto ships that would come in and dock along piers along the coast there before going out into the Atlantic to protect the sea lanes. But this area was also protected by heavy guns and armament and unique buildings. Farmhouses were built along the coast, and the silos weren't really silos. They were lookouts to look out for submarines or other vessels intending to attack ships in the Narragansett Bay. Why would I put a dollar bill into this picture? Well, a very famous American. Since you have a dollar bill, I'm sure in your pocket, you have a picture of George Washington. Some of you may know who painted that picture. Others may not. His name is Gilbert Charles Stuart. He was born in the United States to Scottish immigrant parents. You know, I'm Scottish, and very proud of the fact that he learned his painting skills by going back to Glasgow and learning them at Glasgow University. The reason there are wheels at the house is his father used to be a snuff maker. This is something I used to do as a child. It was very enjoyable and fun. It's like finding hide and seek or looking for treasure. You would go out when the tide went out and stomp around in the mud until you felt something hard and you'd pick it up. And hopefully it was a clam. In Rhode Island, they're called cherry stones and quahogs. Down at the end of that strip of land that I showed you previously is an area or a village called Galilee. Now, it's a fishing village and a place where the ferry leaves for Block Island, where I worked for many a summer. But the picture in the upper left, if you like lobster, you've heard of lobster pots. I don't know why they call them pots. They're cages. Bait's put in there, a lobster crawls in, they haul them up, and away we go. The boats to the right are, as you can see, are fishing boats. They go out way out to sea, out to George's Bank. And they catch all sorts of fish that we've probably eaten here in the dining rooms. But there's a problem. Many of the folks that work these fishing boats are of an age where they no longer can do it. And their sons and daughters do not want to take on that very, very difficult trade. So they're having a hard time recruiting people to come and operate the fishing boats. It is becoming a dying industry. I pointed out a boat, the Block Island Ferry. Goes from a point where it says 108, that's Point Judith, coming over to Block Island. It's where I worked during the summer. To get there on most days, the sea was like a mirror, not very rough. But there were days when it was a rough crossing. I can remember as a young kid taking my first boat trip across, or ferry trip across, to Block Island and being very sick and telling my father I'm staying on the island the rest of my life. Luckily, I overcame that in later years. This is Block Island. It was originally discovered by a Dutch explorer by the name of Adrian Block. Most people think of Massachusetts and Martha's Vineyard as the home to the rich and famous. I'm going to tell you that Block Island is the home to the rich and famous that like to keep a low profile. During the winter, about 400 people live on the island. But during the summer, the population explodes to almost 20,000. That became a major problem. People with money, particularly from New York and Boston, were coming in and buying up land, and the island was becoming desecrated. There wasn't going to be any natural habitat that the island is famous for. I don't know how they did it, but they got a law passed in the Rhode Island Assembly that said that they could impose a 50% tax on any sales of homes or land. That tax is exclusively used to purchase other properties going up for sale. The goal is to eventually have 50% of the island undeveloped with native plants. Today, they have succeeded quite well. 43% of the island is owned and maintained by the local government and is open space to all. These two children are running down paths that I used to run down as a child. And I am so glad to see they still can do that. It is neat to be able to run along the tops of the cliffs, as you'll see in a minute, and through these paths. My father used to say, who grew up in the north east part of Scotland, that many of the plants that on this island reminded him of Scotland. Even when you build a house on the island, and the fairly substantial ones, remember everything has to be brought over on one of those ferries to build these houses. The houses are kept well spaced apart. When I lived there, there was an ecological disaster going on. The island electricity on the island was generated by two diesel generators. Two things. They were very loud and they smelled. But there was a third problem. If there was a thunderstorm in the area, the owners would shut them down, and the whole island would go dark until the storms passed. Today, those generators are gone. Offshore, about a half-mile off the island, there are these 5 windmills, and they generate enough electricity to support the entire island, even with 20,000 people on it in the summer. They generate so much electricity that they had to lay a cable from the island to the mainland so that the additional power that was being generated could go into the U.S. grid. The northeast side of the island has very, very, very high, almost 200-foot high cliffs. You can't see it in the picture, but in the side going over towards the mainland, it gets very, very flat. And there's a great deal of worry as the ocean levels rise that there may be flooding in that part of the island. Once a year, for 72 years, there has been what is called the Round Block Island Race. I wouldn't want to be it because I'd be afraid of hitting somebody. They're so close together. But the race starts in Stamford, Connecticut, comes up the Long Island Sound, and goes around Block Island and returns to Stamford, Connecticut. Again, the cliffs. This is a picture of a lighthouse. It is no longer at that point. It's been moved back about 250 yards. Quite an operation to move that entire building, a building that dates back to the 18th century. But they did it. And they did it because the cliffs were eroding and undermining the lighthouse. One side of the island you can go to beaches very easily. On the Atlantic side, you have to climb down these cliffs. Luckily, in several places, these stairs have been put down, and they are great spots for beach parties. About 2.5 miles northeast of the lighthouse, there is a sunken German submarine, U-505. It was the last submarine sunk during World War II. It was sunk a day before Germany surrendered. It had, previously to being sunk, it had sunk 2 tankers coming out of the Narragansett Bay. Destroyers immediately came out from Newport, sunk it with depth charges, and it laid on the bottom of the ocean for many, many years. About 12 years ago, there was a problem. A bunch of divers went down and started taking things from the submarine. One thing they took, they should never have touched. There are 87 German sailors that died when that submarine went down, and this is their tomb. They took the bones of one of those sailors and brought them to the surface and brought them onto land. When they did, they were immediately arrested. But the question was what to do with the bones. There was a German naval officer at the Naval War College. He contacted his government, and they agreed that he would take possession of the bones. They were placed in a casket, and the Naval War College joined with him, and the casket was interned in the cemetery in Newport, Rhode Island. Subsequently, the German government, with permission of the U.S. government, decided to encapsulate the submarine in cement so that no one else could disturb those graves. In addition, there is a buoy that is above its resting place, and nobody is allowed within a half-mile of that buoy. I said there was a lower part of the island, and you can see very narrow where the Atlantic Ocean is out to the right and a very large bay here. That's where the fear is that water someday will come across and cut off that part of the island. I show this picture because it's very memorable to me. In the lower left, you'll see a collection of buildings, some boats, and then there's a big white building. That's called the Narragansett Inn, and that's where I worked as a teenager during the summer. I would go there and stay there for 9 weeks, living in one of those buildings, the one just to the left of the tree next to the water. That's where 5 of us would live. I worked as a dishwasher, and then I worked as a sort of an aide to the chef. It was a neat place to work. We worked 7 days a week. And there was a sexist thing that went on there, though. Guys could only work as dishwashers or in the kitchen or as bellhops. But as a bellhop, your other job was to cut the lawn and maintain all the shrubbery. Girls could work as waitresses or as chambermaids. The latter two got tips. We didn't get tips. I made $35 a week. I got room and board. The girls generally made on average about $150 a week. I was always very jealous of that. There's a little story, though, that I need to tell you. You see those boats at that dock to the right? On Wednesday nights, we used to scrub the floors in the kitchen area. They were wooden floors, and we used bleach and stuff, and we'd scrub them. And we'd be smelling high heavens from bleach. So we'd go down in the water and go for a swim around 10, 11 o'clock at night. Well, one night we're out there swimming, and one of my buddies to my right was maybe about 10 foot to the right of me, and all of a sudden we saw a fin go in between us. We got out of the water, and we were happy that we did, because next day a mako shark was shot right in that area and killed. This is Narragansett Inn, still open today, still a great place to go and spend a week. Sam Mott was the owner of the Narragansett Inn, and he also owned this building, the Spring House. And this is where another sexist thing came in. On Thursday nights, he would bring a band over from the mainland and would have a dance in the ballroom on the first floor of the Spring House. All males that worked for him were required to go to the dance and stay for a minimum of 2 hours and dance with the guests. Can't leave without addressing food. That's a swordfish problem. In the Narragansett Inn, we used to have people come in June and early July and ask for swordfish. The problem is you can't start catching them until mid-July and August. So they got swordfish, frozen swordfish. This would be a traditional shore dinner, lobster, clams, and other sort of things. The bottom picture is something unique to Rhode Island. It's called Johnny Cakes. They're like pancakes, but they're made with cornmeal. They're delicious. The thing on the right is called clam cakes. I love them. Sprinkle them with powdered sugar. Absolutely fantastic. This is not on Block Island. We're back on the mainland. And it's quite near where Tanya Richard grew up, at least the city that she grew up. This is another mansion. relatively new mansion. Some of your grandkids would know who lives there, Taylor Swift. I thank you again for joining me on a tour of a place in an area that I grew up and I still have very pleasant memories about. Hopefully you'll be able to join